Hello and welcome to the Transcendent Knowledge Podcast, episode number 26. And this episode is going to feature both Jimmy and Cyberdisciple in a three-way conversation. So fingers crossed that the technical side of this is all going to work. So I would like this episode to be a follow-up to the last conversation that I had with Jimmy, but also involving Cyberdisciple. So Jimmy and I recorded a couple of different episodes together, and the topic of the topics that we covered in the recording were quite spread out, diffuse all over the place. And over the subsequent recordings, it became clearer and clearer what the key topics we need to cover are in order to... I think that the ultimate aim, as I see it, of these recordings are to get Jimmy into a place where he can accurately paraphrase the egodeath theory. And I think that for this conversation, I would really like to focus very squarely, very centrally on the topic of determinism and eternalism. So in light of that, I just want to mention one thing. So Jimmy, I listened to a recording on YouTube that you made recently with Speed of Sound, also Mike Bruzenak, right, on his YouTube channel. And you did actually mention your conversations with me and also the subject of block universe determinism, which, as I said, that's the core concept that I want to cover today. And you paraphrased it quite accurately. But I just wonder if you could repeat for the purpose of this podcast, what exactly does the word determinism mean to you?
Let me see. Well, in light of, if you consider eternalism, determinism, I would relate it to what Plato called, the moving image of eternity. We have this illusion of time and space, but I think I've heard you speak about it as like a holographic illusion that's created within the block universe. And, and that's really all I could really attribute it to, like, to say from the standpoint of eternalism, determinism might mean a word that refers to the illusion of matter, of movement in matter. I don't know if that's clear. I can try to, put it a bit more, be more articulate about it. Let me see.
Can you just clarify, what do you think, in the concept of determinism, what is it that is determined?
Well, a lot of times when when people have these discussions, it's usually, they speak of the will being determined. It's always a discussion surrounding free will and no free will. And I think that's, what interests people most in these types of discussion. Free will and the lack of it. And within, it's determinism, like I've been hearing the podcast throughout the year. And I've heard you mention that, Michael Hoffman switched from using determinism to eternalism because you have so much misconception surrounding that term. And I think that's why it's hard to, pin it down in a discussion like this relative to eternalism. I kind of see determinism in within the model of eternalism. The best, you've probably heard the term hard determinism. The way kind of Einstein referred to it as the atoms as billiard balls, just, flinging their way in the only possible way they can, according to cosmic law. And yeah, that's kind of what I'm getting at. But it's hard to speak of that because you have to speak of the motion of matter when in fact, from the vantage point of eternalism, there is no such thing occurring. There is no movement. Everything is frozen, from beginning to end. Hence block universe, But I don't know. I don't know if that's getting to it at all so far. Would you agree with any of that?
I think that what you just said does incorporate both causal chain determinism and block universe determinism. And I'm quite keen to distinguish between those two separate models. And I wonder do you have a clear understanding of the difference between...
Yeah, that's why. Causal chain is another way I've heard it put, and I think people who believe in like a type of hard determinism or causal chain determinism, they see determinism as something that's causally happening, throughout the universe, whereas in eternalism, that no such thing takes place. There is no cause and effect. Everything just already is. That I don't know. Maybe you could articulate it a lot better than that. The distinction.
I think you've got it right. I think you do understand the difference between. So you use the term hard determinism, and I'm not sure which model you were referring to in calling it, which one you meant was hard.
It's usually associated with Ramesh Balsekar. He will say that everything that occurs to cosmic law or God's will, that everything is, according to God's will. You make no choice of your own. That's usually what's considered hard determinism. The reason why it's considered hard determinism as opposed to maybe soft determinism is because, soft determinism sort of encompasses what that physicist that died recently, Stephen Hawking, would talk about statistical determinism, where things are not necessarily fixed concretely, but there's a bit of open freedom to it. So but nevertheless, it does follow a determinist fashion. In other words, like you can make your way to the mall, for instance, but there's sort of like freedom on the way to get there, or something like that. Whereas in hard determinism, no, there is only one way you're going to make it to that mall. I don't know. There's kind of like a bit more openness in the type of determinism that Stephen Hawking was talking about. And I think that's why it intrigued a lot of people, because I guess they're not really turned on by the idea that everything's being predetermined. You remember, I don't know if you remember, I had mentioned last time that I spoke to Busybone about that. And, one thing I had brought up to him, because just after my psychedelic experience, I was being so influenced by Ramesh Balsekar. I was speaking in these terms of like no free will. And I remember pitching that to Busybone, and he came back at me, and he started like weaving and nodding his head to the side. And like he would go, that was determined. That was predetermined. That was predetermined. Bobbing his head to the side, like kind of, in a way, I guess he thought of it as flaunting his free will in front of me, and it was real interesting to have that experience, because here I am telling Busybone about how there's no such thing as free will, and yet he's over here flaunting it in front of me. It's a meeting that I never would have expect to happen. Me sitting in front of this, legend in hip hop. And he got me to thinking when I went home, man. I'm like, man, I started rethinking like Ramesh and all that, and I think that's when I finally got led into Eastern philosophy and compatibilism. Ramesh, if you hear Ramesh, he'll say, like, I don't know if you hear a lot of his talks, but he'll say people will ask him, well, what does free will come from then? And he'll sort of give this like compatibilist response and say, free will is what God was forced to give you so that daily living can happen. Daily living cannot happen unless yet every human being is free to do whatever he wants in any situation. But nevertheless, he maintains that all action is destined by cosmic law. He's not real, like you want him, like in the way you kind of want me to say something very concrete and to the point. Like he's not like that with, when it comes to free will and his view, because you would think he's a hard determinist just by hearing him speak, but then he'll say something like that, and then he'll kind of throw some compatibilist, caveat out there at the same time, but he's not too clear on how it works together.
No, I think that's common. the idea of no free will is usually not very popular. Many people recoil against it and will kind of shut down a conversation, or will, want to.
Yeah, and to add, because there is something I wanted to say. Add to that I'm glad you brought that up. It's because what I was thinking about Busy Bone. I'm like, man, I'm thinking, this guy, he achieved all this. He feels in his own ego that he achieved all this greatness on his own. All the songs that he ever did. And then some guy just comes in a pizzeria and tells him he has no free will, and it's some insight he got out of psychedelics. I think from that point on, he kind of went into an argumentative tone between him and I think I mentioned, I don't know if I mentioned it last time, but he slammed his hands on the table. He said, "I'm done." After that last question he asked me about whether evil exists inside meditation, and he took off, went to go order a drink. But it was interesting, man. We had a whole crowd surrounding us, and we were having this conversation. And then when he slammed on his table, everyone kind of just went their own way. It was interesting.
Right. I just wanted to extract from what you just said what I see as the central concept in distinguishing between. I'm not going to use the term hard determinism. It's too unclear what that means. I'm just going to stick to two basic terms, which are causal chain determinism on the one hand, and block universe determinism, which is also called eternalism on the other hand, right? I want to very clearly distinguish between these two concepts. And I think that a good distinction between them was contained in what you just said. So I just want to extract it. What you said, as I understood it, was in causal chain determinism, you have a process of causation occurring in time, which in the last time we spoke, you used the word unfolding, and I took it to mean the same thing, right? So that's causal chain determinism. And then you also said to contrast that with block universe determinism, or eternalism, as Michael Hoffman now calls that in that model of determinism, there's no causation in time occurring because all of the causation has already happened. Everything has already unfolded. So you've got the full chain from the beginning to the end of time, or you could look at it as the beginning of your life to the end of your life, all existing at once, all in one go. So there's no unfolding. There's only something that has already eternally unfolded, right? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that definitely, pretty much echoes what I said. Yeah, definitely.
Right. So I think that a point of confusion that happened in our last conversation is that when you were reflecting your understanding of the egodeath theory, sometimes you seemed to be attributing causal chain determinism to Michael Hoffman's view, Michael Hoffman's theory, but other times you seem to say that Michael Hoffman is expressing the other kind of determinism, block universe, eternalist model of time.
Well, I mean...
Okay. Did you agree or disagree?
Well, there was something that you mentioned, because you said that, you mentioned that Ramesh and Michael Hoffman are concluding the same exact point. So I kind of, figured that maybe, Michael was referring to causal determinism in some way through the block universe, that, yes, everything's determined. We have, in the psychedelic experience itself, you don't, the mystic no longer identifies with the material body because they see themselves as all events occurring, all time, past and future collapse into the moment. And so, they have no identity.
So which model of determinism would that be then? What you've just explained?
I consider it, like, the way I was sort of thinking about it and is like a direct experience of the block universe, or the mind fuses with the block universe. Like it becomes the block. And, so there is no time, to unfold because, everything is occurring at once, simultaneously. But that's the vision inside the experience. But when you return to the baseline of consciousness, you return to space and time and the egoic illusion, but nevertheless, you still have in your memory banks the vision of where that ego death happened, where, there was no longer an ego, but there was still awareness there. And it's that awareness that, you could recall from your memory banks. And, a lot of the research is saying the reason why it's becoming so efficacious with all the benefits of depression and all that, and PTSD, the cancer patients, fear of death, is because it's the memory of the experience. It's not a drug. They always emphasize it's not a drug you have to take over and over. What the pharmacists want, something that's really expensive and you have to take every single day. It's just the single memory of that experience that's helping the volunteers. Therefore, they don't have to take any medication ever again. The memory of the experience is a big thing. Even Roland Griffiths talks about he's never seen any other type of drug in his experience, like 50 years plus experience, that has such a vast impact on the memory. People who have this experience and they'll mull them over unto death, I think, once you have it. But man, I probably got off on a tangent right there. But I guess I was trying to emphasize, when you return to the egoic, the baseline of consciousness, you return to this impression of causal chain determinism, even though you had a glimpse of it where that didn't exist at all. And I think that's why a lot of people, when they have the experiences, they say that the psychedelic experience is more real than real. It's the most real experience they can have. And this was like invariably amongst the volunteers, it's emphasized. Rick Strassman talked about it with his DMT volunteers. Roland Griffiths talks about it with the psilocybin volunteers. And, and so like returning to this egoic, illusion, you often have that impression that you're returning to a kind of dream, that's like the psychedelic experience was the brief moment that you woke up, or as Aldous Huxley put it, the mind at large, that, our brain right now is a filter on reality. And what the psychedelic does is remove those filters. And, you become like the Arhat in Jainism, or I don't know if you ever heard of the Kevala Jnana. I don't know if I'm butchering that pronunciation, but it's they say at the core of everyone's soul is omniscience, of all knowing, being able to see all things. And that's, to me, that sounds aligned with all, of course, all the other major religions. God is within, or Brahmin, or even, because I really think that, what Hindus were speaking about is no different from kind of our discussion, but we're just kind of speaking about it in a more refined fashion. Hopefully, that is the goal too, I think. That, when a yogi said, we spoke about Brahman, is precisely what we're talking about when we speak of eternalism and the block universe. They're just kind of two different ways of describing it. But I really like the egodeath theory, man. I think it's a real, because it's not a religion in itself. It's just, it's a theory and it's a way to explain religion. And, I find it really attractive, man. It's one of the reasons I wanted to have this discussion with you. Not only that, it's because I find these topics infinitely interesting.
Sorry, Cyberdisciple, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I was going to see what you were going to say.
Right. So to be clear, I just want to, again, try to extract the relevant point and summarize to point the conversation towards the ego death theory. What the picture that emerges in what you just said is a two-state model, a two-state cosmology, I guess you could say, where you've got the egoic state of consciousness on the one hand, and then the intense psychedelic state of consciousness on the other hand. And as I understood what you said, it's eternalism or block universe determinism, where everything has already unfolded in time. There's no ongoing process of causal unfolding in time. That's block universe determinism. That model of time is the one that is relevant to mystical altered state experiencing, which is the kind of experiencing that happens on like a high dose of LSD or high dose of mushrooms. Am I correctly characterizing what you said there, Jimmy?
Yeah, I mean, what you said, it reminded me of like, there used to be, if you go to Ramesh's Wikipedia page, he has some quotes there. You probably have to go in the Wayback Machine now to find them, but it says, it say like something like the final truth, as, you know, Maharaj and Nisargadatta all said, and all the sages before them have clearly stated, is that, you know, there's neither creation nor destruction, neither birth or death, neither destiny nor free will, neither any path or any achievement. All there is consciousness. And I think that's what they mean by that. You know, it's if there's no destiny and there's no free will, because there's no ego there to have a destiny nor free will. There's just a consciousness that contains all, in a sense. If that reflects anything of what you said.
Okay, so I think that as far as possible, please can we try to avoid referencing thinkers and writers, because we can do all that later. But so, I mean, I agree, Ramesh Balsekar is highly relevant to this conversation, but he's also not fully relevant to this conversation. And rather than trying to pick out the relevant parts of Ramesh Balsekar, I would rather just eliminate these external thinkers and writers from the conversation as much as possible, and just focus on this one. Because I just want to make a point, Jimmy. Like, you're very good at accurately paraphrasing many writers and many theories, such as Ramesh Balsekar, Alan Watts, Paul Tillich, etc. But you cannot yet accurately paraphrase Michael Hoffman's egodeath theory. And it's that point that I'm trying to reach through these conversations. So let's try and keep it focused just on this one theory and this one set of ideas that the theory involves. So I was talking about the difference between causal determinism and non-causal block universe determinism. And as I understood it, what you just said earlier was that the intense mystic experience, the ultimate mystical experience, is characterized by block universe determinism, but not by causal chain determinism, because causal chain determinism, I took it, you correctly identified, is something that is relevant to the egoic state of consciousness, or the ordinary day-to-day state of consciousness. But in the extreme altered state, when you're tripping balls, when you're really, really high on drugs, and you're tripping, as you described when you took 5 grams of mushrooms, your first trip, the experience that you have fits in with the block universe idea. Is that right?
No, yeah, definitely. That's definitely what I experienced. I think one interesting thing you left, it was episode 16 I think we last spoke on, and at the very end,
yes,
you told me to look into acedia, and because I had mentioned that because there is this impression that you get of the block universe, or of the omniscience of everything have already been done. When I was coming down, there was I guess when the ego was coming back, when you're returning to the baseline, there was, I guess, almost like a mesh of the two states that was occurring, that like I felt this extreme boredom, that if my ego couldn't escape this intense ennui, it was almost like, because everything occurred, or because it was like deep boredom in knowing everything, a kind of intuitive knowledge that was occurring. And I remember thinking, like, man, if this doesn't end, I'm probably liable to commit suicide, because it's overwhelming. And luckily, I mean, eventually it wore off, and at that point I was able to sit up, because throughout the whole time, I don't know if this happens to you when you take a high dose, like it drags you down, like you feel like magnetized to the ground. Like I think Terrence used to say, the major program to be executed is like hanging onto the ground. And Yeah, that's what I remember. Like I remember when I was able to sit up. That's when I realized, oh, okay, I'm coming down. Like it's getting out. It's finally wearing off.
It sounds like it's like you wanted to prove that you could do something. I was thinking what you're saying about the ennui and the boredom and the suicide idea. It's like the suicide idea is like the prove you can do something, even if it's canceling yourself out and ending yourself.
Oh yeah,
it's like this attempt by the ego to prove that it can will something.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. Who else? I think Shunyamurti talks about that too. Like people who, not even in the context of tripping, but people who commit suicide anyway are still trapped in the illusion that they're an egoic will that's able to do anything at all.
Well, I think that there's like a distinction, like an important distinction here between experience of something in the altered state and then the way we talk about it afterwards. And I think that's also speaking to some of what Max is bringing up about other thinkers and just the whole also being able to describe things and summarize things. There's like the experience of eternalism or of block universe determinism, whatever term we use. Like, what is that? What do we mean when we say we are experiencing that, as opposed to having an intellectual discourse about it like we're doing now? But what does it mean to actually experience that? What was that like for you?
Well, for me,
and it's tricky because we are automatically back into discourse, right? On when we're trying to describe it, but it's kind of like trying to get at like, what was that like? What was that like to, when we say experience a block universe or something like that?
Man, let me see. Like when it occurred for me, some things that I do remember that stood out is that whether my eyes were closed or open, there was a point where this mandalic vision completely encompassed, everything that I guess my mind's eye could see. It was, bright, vividly colored. It did have motion in it. Like, it wasn't something that was frozen. It was something that was kind of, I guess you could, a lot of yogis, or you see in religious scripture that God is unchanging. And I guess in a sense you could say that the mandalic pattern was unchanging in that it kind of pulsated in an unchanging way. It was a pulsating energy that just kept on going. And, but it represented, and somehow there was an intuitive feeling in my consciousness, I guess, where in staring at this mandalic pattern, it represented every possible pattern that could be. And in other words, like when you hear in scripture a lot of times that God is outside of space and time, with people mistakenly imagine a bearded white man, a bearded figure that's outside the continuum, that's completely outside the continuum. But they fail to see that what outside of space and time really means is inclusive of all space and time. That's what it means. And that's, in staring at the mandalic pattern, that's what it felt, that almost as though I was seeing the undergird of every single possible permutation that could manifest in reality. I was seeing where the source of it, every single thing was there, every sound, every song, every experience, you were every person, everywhere, everything that ever was. I think I mentioned to Max last time, that, Maria Sabina would say, it's the place where everything is known, was her, metaphor for it. But, that was the impression that I got in it. It was, almost like my consciousness itself. I no longer there was a certain point where I no longer identified with the ego. The ego wasn't there anymore. It was just that mandalic pattern that represented all things, the parama in Gnosticism, or the all. There's many names for it in religion, but that, at least, I mean, if I had to say something about it, it's a bit more than just metaphor. To add, a visual aspect of what was going on, that's what I would say.
And how did that, I think the rest of my question has to do with, how did that relate to your sense about, say, the future? Because I think that's a big concept of that we hang out with a lot, and hanging out with the egodeath theory is this concept of what's going to happen in the future and what's my relation here and now to that idea of the future.
No, you're right. And that's what I was trying to tell Max, that like when I came down, it wasn't some immediate thing that I suddenly had a revelation like Ramesh Balsekar. The revelation he had was that everything was, this causal determinism, this everything was fixed in time. That Ramesh had it like it was revelatory for him. But what I came down with after having that experience, it was like it wasn't like I came back and said, oh, this world line is the one specific world line, or I didn't know exactly how to think about it, but for some reason, I had a slight intuition that I'm like, man, what if like the reason why you can have an experience of everything like that is because that, everything is fixed in time. There is really, while we think we're doing things and performing actions, everything's really just occurring, in the one fashion that it could. And, that's what got me to Google psychedelic experience and, I guess lack of free will or no free will or determinism. And that's when I found Ramesh Balsekar. And then when I was searching Ramesh Balsekar, I got really interested in Ramesh Balsekar. That's when I found Michael Hoffman's website, because he lists Ramesh Balsekar. He cites Ramesh Balsekar. And so I was reading Ramesh Balsekar's citation from Michael Hoffman's website. And then I'm like, what the hell am I reading? And I look at the website. I'm like, egodeath.com. I had to go to the main page, egodeath theory. I'm like, whoa, what is this? My eyes lit up, man. I was like, this is, it just resonated completely. That's how I got into it. But it wasn't something that I realized right away. It kind of it took some edging a little bit. That's what I was trying to tell Max.
Yeah. Well, again, there's this thing between what we experience and then how we conceive of it and how we talk about it. And
it's funny because Max knows that I listen to a lot of Alan Watts, and he talks about these Zen masters that are all trying to, each one of them are having a contest who can articulate the void the best, like kind of like what we're trying to do here. Who can articulate the block universe the best, right? So they're having this contest amongst these Zen masters, and then they turn to this like Zen master that hasn't spoken yet, and they ask him, and he says nothing, and he wins the contest. Because he doesn't say anything, and they're all freaked out, like, holy shit, he just he blew our minds. But but to say something about it, I think, man, I don't know. There's also Zen like Huang Po. I don't know if you ever read Huang Po's quotes, but he is real insightful on speaking on the Zen or whatever you want to say, story. But I mean, I guess your line of questioning sort of invoked already what I wanted to say about that. Cyber.
Oh, right. I was just going to say, just to be clear, to kind of, again, summarize, to bring it back to the main point. Jimmy, what you seem to be saying, which I would agree with, is that the intense altered state experience is like block universe determinism. It feels as if everything in time has already happened. There's no further unfolding. There's just one eternal moment of time when everything happens. And then you go back to the ordinary state of consciousness, and the block universe determinism model doesn't apply to ordinary experience. So we have a two-state model here, right, where the intense altered state is, you can model it by block universe determinism in the sense that the phenomena that you experience in the intense altered state are suggestive of block universe determinism. It feels as if block universe determinism is the case when you're tripping very hard. But then in the ordinary state of consciousness, the other state, when you're not tripping very hard, it doesn't feel as if everything has already happened and block universe determinism is the case. Because in the ordinary state of consciousness, you get the sense of a flowing time and a future that has yet to happen.
No, I completely agree. I was going to say one aspect we haven't touched on, and I mentioned it. I mentioned that email I sent to you like a couple hours ago. I meant to send that like a week ago, man. I just hadn't had the time. But one thing we haven't touched on is because accompanying with this mandalic pattern and this feeling, this intense transformation of consciousness into the block universe or what have you. There's also accompanying all this agape, as the Greek spoke of it, or it's also mentioned in Christianity, a deep, infinite, unconditional love. That also was part of the experience that I recall, man. And I know we haven't really touched on the emotion, like, because we're having this discussion. Who's speaking, right? If everything's the block universe. And so
yes, but remember that we said, but Jimmy, I must interrupt you there. Remember that what I was saying, it's a two-state model, not a one-state model. So as we are having this conversation now, we're not tripping. We're not in the intense mystic experience. So therefore, from this point of view, block universe determinism is not the case. So it's actually quite easy to answer your question right now. It's us that are talking, right? There's no mystery to that because we're not having mystical experience.
Oh no, I agree. But I guess what I was going to get at was that a lot of mystics who have mystical experience, they return. They don't identify their ego with the material body. They in having seen the unitive state of all everything being part of the block universe, they identify as the block itself. And they talk about in religion original sin, where you have this impression in your consciousness that you're a separate entity, that what we spoke of last time of Alan Watts, the skin encapsulated ego. So we have these assumed roles, right? These assumed encapsulated egos. And so we could see it as though, each skin encapsulated ego speaks to another. But for I suppose the mystic, it's really we're instruments or vessels through which the block universe itself, wills its cosmic law. And, so for the mystic in experiencing that unconditional love, they're going to speak. They become like an instrument or a music instrument through which the mystical experience whistles through, that's why the love aspect and so forth. But I don't know if you wanted to take it in a different direction.
I just had a thought there that what if they don't do that? I think that's something that's been bouncing around in my mind recently, that it is perfectly possible, I think, to have sort of what we are calling a mystic experience and then not lead one's life any differently. A mystic experience does not equal someone then living their life according to some sort of lesson that they are basing out of that mystic experience. And I think that that's often throughout, let's say, the 20th and 21st century, a lot of the discourse I'm familiar with about mysticism often assumes that will be the case, that people will take some sort of lesson from that and then live their ordinary state life differently. And that's one thing I find interesting, compelling. Say, for example, my time with the egodeath theory is that it doesn't really do that. It really stresses what Max has been stressing here, this two states, that there may not be a connection between one's experience in the altered state and then how one lives one's life, because they are two different realms. They're two different modes of operating. And there is certainly some people who want to say, there are people who want to say, well, we've had this experience, we should base our lives off of it in X, Y, and Z way. But that is a bit different from kind of defining the experience or having the experience. Then you get involved in a sort of cultural project or sort of moralism or sort of ideas about how to lead one's egoic life. Do you see what I mean? That there could be people who just, it actually reminds me of some of that, old kind of very familiar, often kind of like Zen thing about the chop wood carry water thing, right? Where you have the experience, you become enlightened, and then you go back to doing what you were doing beforehand anyway. Just in it, the only difference is that now you're enlightened, and that's it. That's like one of the Zen koans, I believe.
No, yeah, I've heard it. I actually am very enamored by the mystical theology of Western religion, of mysticism and Eastern philosophy. The mystics that I've studied, they refer to mysticism as something of practice. It's frequented. So, like, when I imagine a mystic, I see someone as they probably frequent the state far more than we do. I don't know how often you take psychedelics, but I've always restricted it for myself once a year. I don't know why I do that. I don't know if it's just a tradition or something I've developed, but I'll take a huge dose like once every year. I haven't done it this year, but I think my last one was something like 16 dried grams, and I always try to take it higher. And but I imagine a mystic is someone who develops, because I know, there's an egodeath theory. There's it can't be accessed naturally, and so if you consider, like, sometimes I consider maybe there is natural methods like hesychasm. I don't know if you've heard of that, but these types of contemplative retreats that these mystics would have, and or the prayer closet, and they would constantly refer to this for answers, for moral guidance. So like they were going back at it pretty quickly. I think even Terence talked about where, like, he would advocate heroic doses, but he didn't recommend them very frequently. He said, if you're taking like 70 milligrams every other day of DMT, by the end of the month, you're going to find yourself a very completely different person, and even in the research, like, they talk about that it's like it's a social threat, to society, but it might be a good threat because it might disrupt the order of things. But of course, the world is not obviously in great order right now to begin with. It could be a good thing, but I don't know, man. I feel that they're definitely influential. I mean, even in the research, the benefits and so forth, like the cancer patients, they completely lose their fear of death. There's if you don't mind, have you guys seen the Revealing the Mind, the promise of psychedelics?
I just have to admit I'm very opposed and skeptical to the therapy, the psychedelics for therapy.
Okay, all right.
I have studied it, but that's really another conversation. I think the point I'm trying to summarize is that I think that there's like mysticism as like a social practice, so to speak, or a cultural institution, and then there's experiencing that we often describe as mystical, and they're not the same thing. So the researchers at Hopkins and NYU and places like that are doing a model of mysticism as a social practice and saying it has X, Y, and Z benefits and things like that. Whereas we're much more in the like almost pure theoretical area. And in a way, I view that as more democratizing because it does not ask you to change your life and give up your lifestyle and start doing, I don't know what, doing whatever, going to therapy centers, joining a cult, whatever these things happen to be.
No, I agree. I mean, even in the research that they speak of, one single high dose, it's just one dose that they're giving volunteers that have these lasting effects. But, I think I'm really referring to maybe early mysticism, like, as practice, between first century onward, where, it seems as though mystics were frequenting these states and you're right. I don't really see that today. I don't see anyone doing that today, including myself. I don't take, I mean, if I was, aspiring mystic, I think I would frequent the psychedelic state maybe more often, or maybe practice, be a little bit more healthy, or have greater probity with with concerning morality. But I know you're right. I think like even it's kind of ridiculed. Like the people who are taking mushrooms today are not scientists or these people who we think should be taking them. It's it's teenagers that live in fucking trailer homes playing Xbox and stuff like that. Like it's real diminished. Like it's not because I really think it at one point long ago, years ago, thousands of years ago, even amongst the shamans, like the Mayans and so forth, like they probably went into it a lot greater, a lot more frequent than we do, I think.
So can I just point out a dynamic that I observe here is that you, Jimmy, are focusing on what you refer to as mystics, and you just used the word shamans as well, as if mystics and shamans are a special type of person who use psychedelic drugs in a special type of way. They do it more often than us common folk, and so it affects the mystics and the shamans differently to how it affects us common folk, people like the three of us who are not mystics or shamans. We're just regular everyday people who sometimes use psychedelic drugs. And I think Cyberdisciple's point is more relevant to the ordinary folk taking psychedelics, whereas you, Jimmy, are just focusing on how mystics and shamans are affected by taking psychedelic drugs. And I think what the egodeath theory does, it's more about how ordinary people, non-mystics, non-shamans, who are not special, who don't necessarily take psychedelics every day or every week, maybe they just have a handful of experiences in their late teenage years, something like that. It's more relevant to those people rather than the mystics and the shamans, okay?
No, I agree. I think the reason maybe I emphasize mystics or shamans because I'm obviously obsessed with mystics and shamans, and I have so many references, bookmarks, books on it. I'm very intrigued by mystics and what they have to say, man, because I really feel that they spoke directly from those experiences.
So it may very well be the case that there is such a kind of person as a mystic or a shaman, and when they take psychedelic drugs and they trip out, either because of something that's special about them or because of something that's special about the way that they use psychedelic drugs, and the quality you referred to is the frequency of their use, that they may use it more often than us ordinary people. And that for those special people, these mystics, they are affected by psychedelics in a different way to the way that us ordinary folk, like the three of us, are affected by taking psychedelics. Do you agree?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think we've touched on this once before, where I mentioned, I'm trying to Marsilio Ficini, I think is his name. With he saw himself in time with a whole row of mystics throughout history that were eventually inevitably going to realize this revelation. So there was, man, if you don't mind, I know you said don't quote. There's one quote from Meister Eckhart. I don't know if you've heard him speak. He says,
well, would you class him as a mystic, as one of these special people, or would you? Right. Okay. So go ahead. What's the quote?
He says, simple people imagine as though when they greet God, that God's going to stand there and they hear. He says, no such thing takes place. The eye which I see God is the same with which God sees me. He says, the knowledge of God, God and I are one in knowledge. That's the way he spoke on the divine, and he was speaking towards a non-duality, and that's another thing I wanted to mention because I know last time in the email, Michael Hoffman wrote that he felt that non-dualism was a beginner approach, and man, I was interested. I don't know if you knew anything about that, of why he would say that, but what I think Meister Eckhart was expressing right there was a non-dualism, the collapse of the subject-object dichotomy that occurs at the heights of the experience.
So Jimmy, it sounds like what you're saying is that when you're talking about these special people, these mystics, the two-state cosmology doesn't really work, because for these special people, the two states pretty much collapse into one.
Yeah, and I wonder
right?
how that is. Yeah, I wonder, because a lot of gurus will say that, you could call the Maharaj and he's going to respond. Yes, that's his ego responding. That they're... So, I see what you're saying. Like, are they always in that state of mind, or do they have this distinction themselves?
Yeah, are they?
Man, from what I read, I don't really think that they speak from that. I think they speak with their identity in that, but I think they have to have some egoic impression, because a lot of the speeches or the quotes are in response to people who, you know what I mean? They're in response of duality. So I think they have this experience that we experience, that you and I are speaking to each other in. But I think they lose their identity in the material body. They don't, they don't place their identity there.
And they don't get it back. They don't get their identity back when they stop tripping. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, or when they try to define themselves, they won't place it in the skin encapsulated ego. They'll see all as one, and I think that's what that's what morality overcomes. And if you see everything else as yourself, then you can't perform any sin upon it. You can't steal from it. You can't rape from it. Maybe you heard me say that to Speed of Sound, that as long as you have this impression of a division, then you can get a one up on reality. But if everything is one, then you're only hurting yourself by hurting the perceived other, So that's why the mystics are often renowned for their probity, because, they're speaking from that place. They're speaking from an identity where everything is one, where there's love for all, and so forth.
Okay,
at least that's what I get out when I read it.
So what I would say is, when you're talking about these mystics, the way that they experience and react to the strong ultimate mystical experience is different from the way that people like us respond and react to the strong mystical experience.
Well, I don't really think there's much difference between ordinary people and mystics, except that maybe mystics just have the experience more often, or something like that. I think the experience they enter into is one and the same with any person can enter into, because it's a potential in all of us. But you're right. There is a point to people doing it nowadays. I think even the way I do it is maybe detrimental. Like I probably should do it more frequently than once a year. It would probably benefit me more that way. I think so. I don't know, because I'm kind of falling back into unhealthy ways, man, like drinking a little bit more often and stuff like that. But, but every individual today, I think it could help it, but I don't think everyone, I think just because people have this experience, like I would consider myself an aspiring mystic. I definitely don't see myself as a mystic, but, it's something, a potential that I would like to, possess, man. Like, I think, I think the experience is beneficial, definitely, for people, but I don't think everyone has the calling for that, to frequent it, to learn more from it, to act, to allow it to guide your actions and so forth. That, I don't know, that maybe there's a reason why certain people become mystics and some don't. There might be more to it than that, and there might be, there's nothing obviously in psychology we can pin down. I've never read a study that would explain that, but I know Terence McKenna would often say, maybe it's just a higher calling for some people.
So what I would say is that the ego-death theory isn't a theory about how these special people, these mystics, have intense mystical experiences and then are changed in whatever way. The way that you're characterizing it is that you're saying that these mystics have intense mystical experiences, and then afterwards, when they're back in the ordinary state, they live their lives differently, or they experience things differently, even after the state has ended.
Yes.
Right? But
yes.
the ego death theory is more... Yeah, right. But the ego death theory is not really talking about that. That, as I said, that phenomenon might exist. There may very well be these special people out there in the world who are transformed in this way, so that they come back from their intense tripping experience, and then they live differently, or they act differently, or they perceive differently, or something like that.
Yeah.
But other people who are not mystics or shamans, they are the people to whom the ego death theory is relevant, right? The ego death theory is talking about how normal people like me and you and Cyberdisciple and Michael Hoffman, how we would experience psychedelic drugs and then be affected by it afterwards, right? So do you understand the distinction there?
Yeah, no, I do. I'm just kind of like, I'm surprised to hear, I guess a disagreement there, or not a disagreement, but I think Cyber said he's not too keen on the benefits in the research. I want to say something. I don't know if you guys can relate to this, but another thing that happened to me was I find myself unable to kill insects afterwards. Like, whereas I used to like swat flies and, kill them and stuff, I would find myself directing them out the door. Or same thing with like a roach or something like that. I don't know if you guys experienced that. And like, I remember Bill Richards saying something like that. He wanted to do a study to see if how they behaved with insects after the experience, because a lot of people were reporting that they were more gentle with insects, that they weren't killing them and stuff. Like, it was just coming up in the reports. And so he wanted to run a study, but I remember that occurred with me. And like, I remember also reading in Jainism, like if you read about the Jains, they were naked people that worship this, mystical experience. That it was, a practice they engaged in often. And, they were people that had such respect for life that they wouldn't even harvest potatoes in fear of harming or killing insects. So I don't know. I've always thought of like the Jains.
But Jains don't necessarily... Jains don't become Jains because they've had a psychedelic experience, right? They're probably raised like that. That's a tradition.
Yeah, no, they're raised like...
to.
No,
that does not have anything to do, right?
No, I agree. They're raised like that, but that's what I'm saying. It's a society that was raised in this fashion to cultivate mystical experience, and not all of them became arhats. Not all of them perfected it. Like, the arhat was the perfected Jain. Someone who mastered the mystical experience.
But what I'm saying is these Jainist people who have such a respect for life that they would never kill an insect, they don't become that way because they've had a mystical experience, right? They become that way because that's how they are raised within their culture, and that's the moral code that is inculcated into them by their parents and their upbringing and their schooling, that kind of thing. It's not as a result of having a massive, profound psychedelic experience in, say, your late teenage years, right? That's not ever the implication that's why someone has become a Jainist.
I was sort of thinking of it in that way, that when you say it's because the tradition, the parents, well, what were the parents doing but entering into these states? Like, there were whole generations of people who cultivated this, and that's why their tradition became that. At least that's the way I was interpreting it. I mean, I don't know if you were like trying to make a distinction right there.
Yeah, because you've just shifted from saying that you might have a mystical experience, and then in your own case, you gave the example of yourself. You had a mystical experience, and then afterwards you stopped killing insects. But with Jains, that's not typically how a Jain decides to not kill insects. It's nothing to do with a strong mystical experience they've had. It's just because that's the moral code.
Oh yeah, no, I see. Okay, I see the distinction then. Yes. Okay, yeah, now I see what you're saying.
Right, so that's the point. I'm really trying to make a sharp distinction between this class of person that you have, that you are talking about, which is people like Meister Eckhart, you named as a specific example of a mystic. We are not mystics here, us having this conversation. We're not people like that. They are different from us. They are special. We are not in the same class of people as mystics are. And what I'm saying is the ego death theory applies to us rather than applying to mystics. It's not a theory about how mystics respond to mystical experience. Rather, it's a theory about how the ordinary mind responds to mystical experience.
Oh, okay, sure. I would figure that maybe it could extend to that being. I never thought of it as specifically a theory on ordinary minds, but.
Oh, it very much is. It definitely. The ego death theory explains how people like us three would experience and respond to the intense psychedelic state of consciousness, right?
Okay. Yeah, I could see that. I suppose we're speaking of a mystic as we're not too sure how they have experienced it, because it may be different from an ordinary mind.
Yeah, because you got it exactly right. We don't know firsthand how mystics trip and how they live their lives after they trip and that kind of thing, because we are not mystics, right? We are not in that special class of people. We're just ordinary people who can take psychedelic drugs and have these very amazing experiences and then come back to normal life again. And the ego death theory, in that sense, applies to us. It doesn't apply to any special class of people. It applies to how Joe Average experiences taking mushrooms at some point in their life, but normally it's like after age 15 or so, between age 18 to 25-ish, roughly, most people first encounter psychedelic drugs, and then they experience it in a certain way, and they may or may not be transformed in a certain way. And what I'm saying is the ego death theory is about that. It's not about any special class of people who you might refer to as mystics.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I figured that maybe like it could at least comment on it. You know what I mean? Like, what would, from the vantage point of ego death theory, how would it describe mystics or something? You know what I mean? Something like that. But yeah, he doesn't.
Forget about mystics.
Okay,
forget about mystics. Bracket them off for this part of the conversation. We are talking about how people like us would trip, because that's what's relevant to us, right? Because we are not mystics. Why would we be so interested in a theory about people who we are never going to be like, who we can never know what it's like to be those people? We can only know what it's like to be ordinary, regular, everyday people. And so the ego death theory is for us. The Cyberdisciple used the word democratizing, and I think that's a crucial point here. It's democratic theory. It's not a theory for some ultra special elite who we can never hope to understand.
Okay, I mean, I don't know if you heard me say earlier, I do consider myself an aspiring mystic, but I accept that. I mean, if you
So you're somewhere in between ordinary people and mystics, right? I wouldn't particularly. I'm not going to comment on whether I would say I'm a mystic or an aspiring mystic or a non-mystic, but I am certainly the target audience of the ego death theory. I reacted to the psychedelic experience in the same way that any person could. I didn't need a special badge of being a mystic to get what I got from psychedelic experiencing. So I'm just trying to point out the democratic element of the ego death theory. It's aimed for everybody. It's not aimed for some ultra special class of people. That's really the point that I'm making.
Oh, okay. No, I definitely hear that. And I mean, I know you mentioned in your discussion with Troy, like the diamond hammer interpretation, to get straight to the point. So no, I respect that, man.
Right. So having said that, I bring it back to earlier in the conversation. What I'm saying is that when we're talking about ordinary people, very much a two-state cosmology applies, which is what the ego death theory brings out, which is to say that we experience time and also control, but we'll get to that later. We experience time and causation in a certain way, and then we take drugs, and for a few hours we experience time and causation in a very radically different way. And then a few hours after that, the psychedelic experience wears off, and we return to the the same experience of time and causation as we had before we tripped, but now we have a memory of the experience that we didn't have before. So do you agree with that shape of how ordinary people take psychedelics and experience them?
No, yeah, absolutely. Everything what you said up to that point was, I think, pretty much sums up what we were talking about.
Right, because I felt like when you started to involve the subject of special people, mystics, into the conversation, you collapsed the two-state distinction. And I want to keep that two-state distinction alive because it's relevant to us. It's relevant to the way that we experience psychedelics. Yep.
Sure, I didn't mean to imply that it's permanently collapsed. I mean, even in the writings of William James, they always speak of the mystical experience as ephemeral, as, short-lived. It's not something that is permanent. And there's a lot of talk in mystical amongst theologians. There's arguments and stuff. I don't know if you've heard of whether Christ was fully man or fully God or both in between or so on and so forth. The reason I think they have these arguments is because they either are maybe unaware of the mystical experience or they're not too sure of the nature of it, and I think William James is right. It's ephemeral. It's not something that's permanent. You couldn't act if it was permanent.
Right, so William James, in that sense, William James is correct, and his thinking is in line with the ego-death theory in specifying that the intense mystical experience, which you get when you take LSD or mushrooms, is ephemeral. It's time-bounded. You experience the ordinary state, and then you temporarily experience the altered state, and then you return to the ordinary state. And for most people like us, we have lives to live, we have jobs to do. We can't spend all of our time in the intense mystic state. It's a limited thing that you might do once a year, you might do it 5 times a year, whatever, but you're not in it all the time. So the two-state model clearly applies, right? You cannot escape from this reality of 2 separate states of consciousness. The one that you're in by default all of the time, and then the one that you're only in for a small minority of your waking life, which is the psychedelic experience. So I'm really trying to hammer this concept that the ego-death theory is a 2-state theory, and that's the only way that it could be practically and realistically relevant to ordinary people, which are, after all, its target audience. It's not aimed at some special class of people that we can never be, or we could aspire to be, but we may never succeed in our aspirations. It doesn't. The ego-death theory doesn't demand that of us. It just asks that we be ordinary people experiencing drugs the way that any normal person would experience, including you referenced earlier, like people in a trailer park who play Xbox all day. Or it might be slightly more refined people than that. People who are maybe like you, who don't just sit playing Xbox all day, but aside from your regular life where you work and you have your relationships and your family, that kind of thing, you also like to be an autodidact and to read a lot of books and inform yourself. The ego-death theory is relevant to that broad swathe of people, which includes people like yourself, the smarter people, the autodidacts, the readers among us, and also to the trailer park people who don't necessarily read a lot of books, but they just play Xbox all day, but they might also take mushrooms sometimes in their life, right? So the ego-death theory is democratic, whereas the model of I wouldn't say mysticism, rather mystichood, being a mystic, is not very democratic because it demands that you be a part of this ultra special elite class of people. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. And I mean, I'm not too sure, mystics become mystics by their own, it could be, by their own volition, sometimes I think for some of them, it's just, it's natural, like a mystical experience becomes natural to them, but I mean, some of them go through hardships, like some of them will there's stories like Anthony the Great, he locked himself into a hut for like over 30 years and he would get food from a little hole in the wall, and people thought that he was going to emerge like mad and, crazy, but he came out healthy, serene, and enlightened. So yeah, I mean, it took him a while, but I mean, he became a mystic that way. But I don't know. That's why I find mystics interesting. I don't think they're necessarily like an elite class. I think they may just be aware people in that they somehow they listen to that higher calling, like I was mentioning earlier. Because I don't think you necessarily have to be some elite person to be a mystic. Yeah, a lot of the mystics were developed in the early ages by poverty. They didn't want to live poorly inside the town, so they retreated to the hills where they had mystics had temples and stuff like that, and they would accept them in. So and sometimes they would become a mystic that way. So it gets really deep, man.
I think some of Max's point here is that would still be a small percentage of a population who would do that, and thus it is some sort of identifiable group, right? Whereas our like interest in the egodeath theory is that it potentially applies to everyone, because it's simply saying here's a quick explanation for easily summarizable explanation of like what goes on in this altered state of consciousness and the loosened cognition state, that feeling of eternalism and a certain feeling of not being in control of the future, of one's own future thoughts. Boom, simple. Easily digestible by people, by anyone.
But when you say apply to everyone, of course you're excluding mystics, or...
No, I'm not. I don't mean to exclude mystics. I think some of the thoughts I've been having in this conversation have been about the mysticism as a social role, as a cultural role, that there's, and maybe even a mode of writing, for example. A lot of our ideas about what mysticism is comes from certain texts. Well, that's also a genre of writing. To write mystical literature is a genre of writing that has certain conventions, ways of talking, etc. And there can be a tendency to say, well, that's all that mysticism is the genres of, is what has been written down about mysticism. And I think that's something that Max and I find really appealing about looking at the egodeath theory, is that it stands outside of that. It looks at that and can talk to those genres of writing and all these definitions of what mysticism is, and address it, but it also stands outside of that and is kind of its own.
Yeah, no, I agree that, and when you say democratize, that it's probably more relevant to speak of ordinary people, because that's the majority of people are ordinary people. And I mean, the only reason I would mention mystics is that I find a lot of the terms in mystical theology interesting. Like I mentioned, I said it, I don't think I mentioned the term, but hypostatic union. Where they're discussing whether Christ is both both states at once, or completely in the other state, and so forth. There's interesting discussion that goes there that I thought that might be relevant. But no, I don't mind taking it in the direction of just speaking towards ordinary people, because that is more relevant to most people.
Right. So, given this sharp distinction between the mystics and the ordinary people, and we've said how the egodeath theory is really only relevant to the ordinary people, looking at that then, what the egodeath theory is saying about ordinary people is that the two-state model of there's the ordinary state and the psychedelic state is firmly fixed. You can't escape from it. You're in the default state of consciousness ordinarily, all the time, from when you wake up in the morning to when you go to sleep at night. And it's only when you take mushrooms and then for a few hours you experience this very different state of cognition, which is also a different feeling of the way that time and causation works, to how you do when you're in the ordinary state of consciousness. That's a central point that the egodeath theory is bringing out and explaining, okay? Right, and furthermore, it goes into more detail than that, because further specifies that the ordinary state of consciousness is characterized as what you've said is like an unfolding in time. From when I wake up in the morning to when I sleep at night, I feel this constant onward moving progression of events, which seems to be linked by certain causal rules which determine the outcome of certain causes. So things tend to go only in a specific way. Like I know that if I flick the light switch, that the light's going to turn on, and I would be surprised if it didn't happen that way. That's ordinary causation. And then that is sharply contrasted with the way that causation appears in the mystic altered state, the intense psychedelic state of consciousness, where, again, as you have said with reference to your own experience, that model of causation doesn't apply anymore, because if you're tripping hard enough, it can feel as if time has already fully unfolded and that there is only one eternal moment when everything happens, right? Which is as we also identified, that's the block universe determinism model, which is also called eternalism. And it's very profoundly, radically different from the model of determinism that applies to the ordinary state, which is ongoing, progressive, causal unfolding, right? So there's a two-state model. I'm really hammering that point home. For ordinary people, the way that we experience psychedelics, it divides life into two separate states of consciousness. Most of the time, you're not tripping, causation works a certain way. In this limited space of time, when you've taken drugs, you are tripping, and for that limited period of time where your body is metabolizing the drugs, causation works a different way. Does that all make sense?
No, I really like the way you put it there, man. I agree with all that. There was one thing, I guess, when Cyber was talking to me earlier about this distinction, I wanted to mention that in that state where you said, all time has already unfolded, and then you return to the baseline, you return to the world line, the causal determinism, or the impression of it. And when I was in that experience, I didn't necessarily have the insight that when I returned to the baseline, I was returning to this one fixed world line. And because in that experience, it almost felt as though my perception was of all world lines that could ever be. So it was kind of hard to come back and realize, everything's this one world line, or the impression that I have in now is that, that cosmic law, that everything's fixed in time. And that's what I meant by it wasn't readily discernible when I returned to the baseline. But it was something that was in the back of my mind, though. It wasn't something that was revelatory in the front of my mind, as in Ramesh's revelation, but it was something in the back of my mind that I had a suspicion of. And, that's what caused me to go to Google and find Ramesh and Michael's website. That's all I wanted to add to that.
So what you call a suspicion, can I ask, do you think that that you could equally say it's a memory that you have? You have the suspicion that there's this other way that things could be, but it's because of the memory of the altered state. Is that right?
Yeah, it was right. And I don't know if you remember, I think the first email that you told me to just throw at you, even if it was unfinished, I did that. And, I think, I had mentioned in some talk where Terence talks about Bell's theorem. I don't know if you've heard Bell's theorem, where they said that every atom that was ever associated with each other, that would mean everything, because at one point all atoms were associated with each other in the Big Bang. No matter how far they've come apart in time and space, are still instantaneously connected somehow. And this is Bell's theorem. And so he thought, something like that must exist to account for the informational content of the psychedelic experience. In that very same spirit or fashion, I felt the same way towards, I guess, eternalism. Like, even though I had glimpsed it inside the memory of the experience, I had glimpsed, like I said, it was more, I had the impression that everything could probably be part of one world line because, I had an impression of seeing all possible world lines in the experience. But it wasn't something that I recognized right away. I guess that's the only thing I was trying to say. It wasn't something that hit me with force. It was something that I kind of had to be pushed into a little bit. But whatever influenced me, obviously there was something there because I was influenced to search determinism. I was influenced to somehow find Ramesh and Michael's website. So there had to be something there. There had, the suspicion of eternalism, I don't know if you get what I'm saying, man. Like, it wasn't directly, the insight wasn't directly to return and realize this one world line because the insight was seeing all possible world lines. Like in any universe that occurred, not just ours, like that was the impression I had in the experience, that it was just every single possibility that could ever be, like you said, all time, unfolded already. But it wasn't necessarily, I didn't necessarily have the idea of any specific, world line when I came back. It was, that somehow, got influenced later when I started reading Ramesh, and it just appeared to make too much sense to ignore. That's how it hit me. I don't know how, I think you spoke about how you got introduced in the first episodes of the Transcendental podcast with Cyber.
Jimmy, can I ask a question about that? Since you're talking about that experience more, was that accompanied by? Did you feel any sense of panic about that? About seeing all those world lines? Did you feel a sense of unease or discomfort, or a sense of lacking your usual way of being able to make decisions and alter the future and things like that?
I would say it only occurred before the height and after, because at the very height I wasn't able to do much at all. I was just my body was just basically lying there on the ground, but my mind became that fractal mandalic pattern. Like nothing else, there was nothing else that existed but that. And so, like, but prior to it, oh yes, man, I feared for my life. I thought I was going to die, man. I was begging my brother to stick his fingers in my throat so I could vomit the mushrooms, but he didn't have any compassion. He was like, man, if they're already in you, if they're going to kill you, they're going to kill you. He didn't want to put his fingers in my mouth. And, and afterwards, like I said, I had that what Max related to acedia, that, it was like overwhelming. I guess it was like the egoic mind's trying to return after the experience. And there was this overwhelming boredom, like, because everything already had occurred. There was nothing to do. Like, so I wanted to end that. And the only way I could perceive ending that, or a chance of ending it, was suicide. But before that became a possibility, I realized the reason that whole thought process was even occurring at all was because I was coming down. And, I was finally able to sit up and return to the baseline.
So you were worried about your capacity, your capability to even do anything.
Oh yeah. At the height, I wasn't, everything became the mandala.
About even your thoughts about what thought would come next, what you would think of next, what you could be made to think.
Oh yeah. All that completely disappeared. Yeah, that's why I always thought it was weird when Terrence would talk about the DMT state. I've never had DMT. I don't know if you've had DMT, but I've only had psilocybin. And, of course, psilocybin is much more long lasting. It lasts hours as opposed to minutes or seconds. And Terrence would often say in the DMT, the part that you consider yourself is intact. Like the egoic mind, you're still able to think, but you're just like, what the fuck happened to reality? And I didn't really have that with psilocybin. Like, I think there was a point at the very height where that egoic chatter just is silent, and it becomes just the mandalic fractal that represents eternalism or what have you. That's at least how I experienced it. And I every time I do it, I try to achieve that when I take psychedelics, like that's what I want to happen. But every time I do it, I still get nervous. I'm still afraid. Like you always have, a lot of people are afraid of like whether you're not going to come back. You're not going to return to the baseline. Like I don't know if you hear.
Did you have that fear?
Yeah, I think I have that fear every time I do it. But because I don't know if you read about the monks that meditate in the mountains and they freeze to death. I always wonder like why that happens. Could it be that they enter the state and don't return, and they get frozen in that posture? So that, I don't know. I'm just speculating, but it's speculation like that keeps me afraid of psychedelics, man. I'm not, I still take high doses, but I plan to take 20 grams for 2020, but I haven't gotten around to it, man, because of everything that happened. But, this whole stupid, virus, but, it's still on the bucket list. It's,
Well, the story you mentioned there about the monks freezing on the mountain, and the earlier one about Anthony the Great locking himself in I think he said a stone room. Those sound like good stories to interpret in the as analogy for altered state experiencing, in which one is trapped in the block universe and perhaps freezes to death when it's frozen there and dies on the mountainside on the rock while you're meditating or in the altered state.
Yeah, I agree.
And the same thing, that Anthony story would be a story of everyone thought he was trapped in the room and wasn't going to survive, but miraculously he survived and emerged enlightened.
Mm-hmm.
This can all be, that can fit my analogy interpretive mind is going now. As you're mentioning these stories, to me that's the value of a lot of these stories, is the imagery of them, to not so much about how we're going to actually behave in our day-to-day lives, but the imagery thereof to express what happens in the altered state.
No, I agree. I absolutely agree. That's that's one of the reasons I mentioned mystical theology, because they do have stories that can bring insight into a discussion like this. Because imagine if you didn't have the ego death theory, what would you rely upon, and, you would have to, of course, look towards scriptural source. I practice hermeneutics and things like that, like very intensely, exegetical, readings of scripture. I look into things like Lectio Divina, the way the mystics would read text. They wouldn't simply read text. They would be practicing, these altered states and then come back to the text. And they wouldn't read it and try to intellectually interpret it. They would now resonate with the text, now having had the experience, because the entire scripture is based out of the experience. There's a lot of mystics that spoke towards that the text ultimately doesn't matter, because it's something that's just a remnant or a byproduct of the experience itself, of direct experience. That's what's truly emphasized. That's what really, if you pay attention, if you're really paying attention, I think what all religions are pointing to is one's direct experience of it.
Right, but Jimmy, so that pushed the conversation slightly into the domain of analogy or metaphor, which is a thing that we haven't really touched on yet, which I think we need to touch on later on in this conversation. But just to bring it back a bit, in response to the question that Cyberdisciple asked you, he was basically asking, the experience that you had, did it include these features which are not feeling like you're not in control, and also feeling fear and panic? And I think that you emphatically answered yes to both of those questions. You, in this first mushroom trip that you had, where you took 5 grams, you experienced a feeling of block universe determinism, and you experienced a feeling of fear and panic, and you experienced a feeling of not being in control. Would you agree that you experienced those 3 things?
I agree. and I think even I was even more fearful than control. Like to lose my volition really wasn't. What was being sucked out of my life at that point was mystery itself. It was like mystery was being sucked out of life, and if I guess when I came back from that experience, what you realize right away is like, wow, I didn't realize like yin and yang. Ignorance is very necessary to have any experience at all. That's what I became grateful for, because you see, if you were omniscient in some intellectual sense, there would be no reason for me to speak right now, because you would know every single thing I was going to say. So it'd be no point to that. That's like you staying in that state of mind. There's no reason to stay in that state of consciousness. That's kind of what it taught me. And what I feared the most was like all mystery of life disappearing, because that's what felt like what was happening. Like all mystery was just being sucked out of life completely until there was no mystery left. And, it wasn't necessarily like the will that was being emphasized, but it's in a way the same thing. If there's no mystery, there's nothing to do, there's nothing to will, there's nothing to control. So it is. I think it's just one way of saying the same thing. It is fear of the mystery being gone is also fear of losing control. I think they're one and the same thing.
Right. It sounds like what you're saying is that in your particular experience, that one time, there was you wouldn't really strongly characterize it as a feeling of loss of control, but you would still characterize it as an experience of block universe determinism, where everything had already happened, and as you said, there's no more mystery to life because there's nothing new that could possibly happen. Everything has already happened, plus coupled with a feeling of it sounds almost like depression that you're describing, but also you had a feeling of suicidality and panic.
Yes, I think that was like I said, I think it was more on the climb and in the come down rather than at the height, because at the height, like it was just the experience itself. Like there wasn't, I don't think there was an ego any more there to fight with the experience and what was going on, or to try to control anything. Everything just became the.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. Right. So there is an element of non-control in this peak of the experience you just said.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So, I mean, that's it certainly sounds from my point of view like that experience you are describing is typically in line with what the ego-death theory explains, which is that you can model the intense psychedelic experience in terms of loss of control and block universe determinism. There's nothing I hear in your description of the experience that contradicts that. It's only when you start bringing in other thinkers, other writers, people like Ramesh Balsekar, these mystics like Meister Eckhart, these people, that you start to try to veer off of this this very narrow, limited, and precise characterization of what mystical experience is about. If you're just talking about your own experience, it's very clear that what you experienced was block universe determinism, all time had already unfolded, panic attack, suicidal feelings, wanting to end your own life, also desperately wanting to end the experience by inducing vomiting. Panic, fear. These are all the core phenomena that the ego-death theory identifies. So I'm saying it's only really when you start to try to interpret it in the light of other writers that you have read and other ideas that you've heard that you start kind of veering off that.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard not to. I do have, I guess, my own understanding, but you can be led astray by semantics, especially, of other writers, or even like, something we haven't, maybe we'll talk about it later. I'll mention it real quick, but I'm pretty sure you've heard of, the multiverse or the, many worlds theory. And it says like, theories that say that not only does every decision you make create a different universe, but it extends to like every collapse of a waveform, every collision of atoms, every event, no matter how minuscule or insignificant that we're not even aware of, proliferates multiple time frames. It doesn't make sense. Obviously, we kind of wrap our heads around it, and it may be that we're not confined to one timeline. We could be living some timelines simultaneously, or infinite number of timelines. The idea of fractal universe, infinite amount of fractal universes, is that they're constantly changing and moving like a tide of cells just washing over the world, just, back and forth, never ends. But why not, right? Why reality? I think,
Jimmy, if I could just try and bring what you're saying now into the terminological lines of the ego death theory. What you're saying is that to clarify or maybe extend the concept of block universe determinism in the light of your own personal experience when you tripped balls, what you're saying is that you didn't just experience block universe determinism in the sense that everything had already happened in this world. You're saying that it went further than that, and that you were experiencing a sense that everything had already happened in this world and every other possible world. So everything that could possibly happen in any universe had already happened, right? So it was ultra block universe. You could almost say maybe block multiverse determinism.
Yeah.
Like everything that could ever happen in any possible world had already happened. Is that what you're saying?
No, you got it. You hit the fucking nail on the head, man. That's exactly what I've been trying to articulate the past maybe hour or so. But I think you said it really, man, I couldn't have said it better myself. Yeah, that's exactly what I've been trying to say, that I didn't get this impression of one world line. I had this impression of every single world line that could ever be. And so it wasn't, like I said, it wasn't readily discernible that this universe only consists of one possible world line.
That it was this world. Yeah, right, okay. With that, I would actually quite like to wind this conversation up, in case my brain turns to mush. But I would like to revisit this. I think we should do this again, ideally another trialogue as soon as possible, if that's okay with the both of you.
Oh, I'm totally cool with it, Max. I love speaking to you, man. Definitely would love to do it again, man.
I'd be happy to. Yeah, definitely. This is great.